We're closing out a decade. Now, we are down to less than 2 weeks left in this decade, and it's time to start talking about the decade. And I want to start with something a little different, which is top 8 Cinderella stories of the 2010s. Now, to be a Cinderella story to me, you have to go to the conference final. That's the minimum. We can argue about teams that are 8 seeds and they get out of the first round and then they lose in the second if we want, but in general, to me, you have to at least get to that third round to qualify as Cinderella, because that Cinderella story becomes, hey, everybody's getting behind this team. Where are they going to go? How far can they go? And it's usually the most popular story of the playoffs is that Cinderella team, that team you didn't expect, the one that breaks through. And for people who have followed my channel for long enough, you might know who's on this list. You might not. So let's go ahead and start things off at number 8. Flyers. Now, what year would it be for the Flyers? It is 2010. It was a good year. That year they finished 7th in the conference. They had 88 points. And the result of their run, finals. And the 2010 playoffs were weird in the East. That it's upset central. And so the Flyers emerged as the best team in the East. It was just a really, really weird year. But for the Philadelphia Flyers, they emerged as the ultimate underdog that year. Now, they would lose in the Stanley Cup Finals, and it would be a goal that nobody knew was in at the time except the guy who scored it. And so if the Flyers, it didn't end as well as they may have wanted it to, but that's usually the case with Cinderella teams. Teams that are lower in the standings, finished with fewer points than most Stanley Cup finalists, are usually the ones that fall short in the end. And I'm thinking back to 82 when the Vancouver Canucks were in the finals, and 81 was the Minnesota North Stars. And I usually cheer for the teams that are the Cinderella team, and thus here I am. But yeah, 2010 Stanley Cup final, Flyers, and they're number 8. Number 7, Montreal. Now, it's not necessarily entirely surprising that Carey Price can get a team into the conference finals, but in 2014 it was somewhat of a surprise. They had come in 3rd in the Atlantic, so decent enough team, but not a team with a home ice advantage in round 1. They had 100 points that year. 100 points aren't what they used to be. Back in the day, I tell you. Back in my day. And yeah, they went to the conference finals before they bowed out. And of course, Montreal fans still talk about that run, and they should. And they'll talk about how, well, we should have won that next round. We're not getting into that today. We're just discussing one fight at a time. We're just discussing the runs these teams have had, and for the Montreal Canadiens, this is as close as they've been in a while to that ultimate goal, which is making sure that 1993 wasn't the most recent Stanley Cup win in their history and bringing the Stanley Cup back to a Canadian franchise. So for me, Montreal, I lot them in a little bit ahead of Philadelphia, but I can understand if people say, well, Philadelphia should be ahead. But Montreal, that was a real surprise that year because, again, they were 3rd in the division and there wasn't a whole lot of expectation. And then suddenly, hey, look, they're in the conference final. Number 6, Sharks. So what year would it be with the Sharks? Well, if you're a Sharks fan, you know. And if you've been a fan of hockey long enough, you know what year that would be for the Sharks. They were, in 2016, they were 3rd in the Pacific. They had 100. No, they didn't have 100. They had 98 points. And went to the Stanley Cup Finals. Now, the interesting thing with San Jose is there's been a criticism for a long time regarding Joe Thornton. That Joe Thornton, he's not a championship caliber player, and thus the Sharks are viewed as a not championship caliber team. Now, right now, they are sitting out of the playoffs as I record this, of course, and we may look back another 10 years from now and talk about teams that were good, not necessarily great, couldn't get it done in the Stanley Cup playoffs. We may eventually be talking about San Jose in that category, but for 2016, they looked pretty good right up until the finals. Knocked out the Blues in the conference final, and then went on to lose to the Pittsburgh Penguins. Of course, that's memorable for me in that was the first year that this channel started to become a thing. Although I was looking back at my numbers from 2016, I'm really surprised I stuck with it. Really, really surprised. My numbers in 2016 were really miserable compared to now. 2017 even, I look back at and I go, wow, that video made 60 cents? Whew, I thought that was more popular. I seem to remember it. 60 cents. All right. So, and that's for the lifetime, not like recently or anything. Anyways, yeah, San Jose, for me, gets 6th with that 2016 run to the Stanley Cup Finals. Again, there were certain criteria to measure to become a Cinderella team. For me, they had to be at least 3rd in the division or a wild card, or a lower seed when we used to do 1 versus 8, which wasn't that long ago. Number 5, speaking of not that long ago, Carolina Hurricanes. Well, it can only be 1 year because they only made the playoffs 1 year in the entire decade. Now, in 2019, they're the number 1 wild card in the East, and it's not only that. Now, they finished with 99 points, which everything's, grand and all of that. And then they went on to the conference finals where they eventually got swept by Boston. But going into that first round against the Capitals, well, they're against the defending Stanley Cup champions. Now, while nobody was taking the Capitals to repeat as champions, for the most part anyways, we didn't see them losing in the first round against Carolina either. And yet, really, history should tell us that's what will happen because they go to the conference finals anytime they make the playoffs. This is kind of the ultimate Cinderella franchise is Carolina. So if they're a wild card these playoffs, and if everybody's going, they peaked early in the year, watch out because it means they're going to go on a run in the playoffs, and they'll be in this 10 years from now when I do the next decade-ending look at Cinderella runs. And Carolina it was an impressive story. Very, very impressive story. Not only the defeat of the Capitals, but it was then the way that they handled the New York Islanders. It was very impressive. They do get swept by Boston. It does take some of the shine off of it at the time, but I still put them at 5th because that was a pretty incredible run by a team that was out of the playoffs in January and went on this amazing run to get into the playoffs, which had a lot of us saying, well, yeah, they went on an amazing run to get into the playoffs, but they might be kind of gassed. No, that wasn't the case. Number 4. And you know what's interesting? So New Jersey's on the board. I did not have a rule with this list that it had to be 1 for each team, that if a team went on a Cinderella run more than once, that I couldn't put them on the board. And I'm saying that because there may be people who are expecting, that I did that. No. That being said, I don't use the same team twice. So for New Jersey, it's 2014. In 2014, they were 6th in the East, so they were a lower seed. 5 other teams went at home ice against them. Now, they had 102 points. This isn't 2014, is it? No, it's 2012. Right now, there's New Jersey fans yelling at me right now. But it's okay. I fixed it. I got it. 2012. As they went to the Stanley Cup Finals. The 2012 run was unexpected in that Brodeur was fading. He was towards the end of his career. The New Jersey Devils in general were not the same team they'd been in 2003 when they had last won the Stanley Cup. The interesting thing is Ilya Kovalchuk, major role in getting them to the Stanley Cup Finals. He was a hero, would be a villain in New Jersey not long after that. But the New Jersey Devils, that run they went on in 2012 was fantastic. And it was one of those cases where in the Stanley Cup Finals, I was really, really torn. Because on the one hand, I'm going, you know what, this Kings run's been great. But it would be nice to see Marty Brodeur get one more Stanley Cup ring before he retires. So it was one of those situations where it was tough. And that Stanley Cup final was pretty unpredictable in that when you go, all right, so now it's going to end, it didn't. New Jersey had a lot of heart, and this was a pretty impressive run by a team that we can look right now at how everything's kind of fallen apart. But in 2012, things looked pretty good. Number 3, and the reason I'm wearing a Predators jersey is that they're number 3. Now, this was in 2017, so not that long ago. They were I don't even have to look at this. I remember they were the number 2 wild card. I do need to look at the points total. They had 94 points that year. And, of course, they went to the Stanley Cup Finals. And you'll notice there's no Stanley Cup champions among these Cinderella runs thus far. 4 finalists who were unexpected. And Nashville doesn't get much more unexpected than that. And I remember first round, the expectation was Nashville was going to be out. And not only were they not out, they made it clear pretty darn quick they were going to the Stanley Cup Finals. Whether it was that sweep over Chicago, which I had it the other. I figured Chicago was going to take them out. I thought, well, Chicago's got one more run left in them. No, they didn't. And Nashville was the one that exposed that Chicago was on the downswing. Nashville's run to the Stanley Cup Final was fantastic. And it even turned this area into Nashville country. Very, very briefly yelled at me from a window when I was wearing a Kings jersey in public. But the Predators, really, in all honesty, that run was galvanizing. It was one of those runs that you end up with, like, I live in BC. Why would fans in BC care about the Nashville Predators? Because of the fact that it was such a heartfelt run, and you got this feeling that maybe Nashville can eventually do it. We're going into 2020. They're sitting outside a playoff spot. Can they still do it? Absolutely. Would it be as much of a surprise if they did it in 2020 as it would have been in 2017? No. That run was stopped, of course, by the Pittsburgh Penguins, who stopped this Cinderella run as well, because Sidney Crosby doesn't believe in Cinderella. Number 2, and I know people are going to have seen this coming, but really, in all honesty, what the St. Louis Blues did this year, it is absolutely insane. Nobody thought St. Louis was going to win a Stanley Cup. Yeah, I know. I had them going to the finals. I also had most of the first round completely wrong. And I knew the Blues had gone on this incredible run, and I thought they were being underrated. But the actual Stanley Cup I didn't see happening. Of course, I didn't see Boston in the finals either. So 99 points is what St. Louis had during the season. And then, of course, they won the Stanley Cup from number 3 in the Central Division. And it's weird because the 2018-19 season at the start, we all went, all right, St. Louis is the third best team in the division. Then around the halfway mark of the season, we're like, all right, so St. Louis is at the bottom of the league. And we don't know whether or not Doug Armstrong might sell pieces off. And then 6 months later, everybody's singing Gloria. And there you go. Your ultimate Cinderella team, St. Louis. The problem is they're number 2. And the reason they're number 2 is because the LA Kings in 2012, and I didn't count 2014 because 2014 was not a surprise. 2014, I know there was the big comeback against San Jose, but it wasn't really as big a surprise to us as it otherwise might have been. The Kings, they were 8th in the West, and they had 95 points. And, of course, they won the Stanley Cup, in large part because Jonathan Quick played out of his mind. Now, going into that playoffs, I mean, I knew Jonathan Quick was good, and I again, being somebody who, total hockey nerd, I would watch as much hockey as I could. I was always telling people, the Kings look pretty good. I think the Kings are eventually going to win a Stanley Cup. No inkling, though, that 2012 was that year. But I felt like they had with Doughty, with Kopitar, and with Quick in net. I thought they were pretty set. And Jonathan Quick, I always knew was a good goaltender. He became a fantastic goaltender during that playoff run. And it was a year after Tim Thomas's amazing playoff run for the Bruins. And yes, when I'm doing lists for videos about this decade, you may very well see a video list on best goaltending performances in the playoffs during the 2010s. There are a lot of things for the 2010s that I could do videos on. Watch throughout Christmas, because lots of lists I can do when there isn't hockey on and I don't need to worry about being up late at night watching games and doing reviews. But the Kings, for this video, that 2012 run, just narrowly edges out the Blues because the Blues had more points. They were also a number 3 seed, so they were ahead of the wild card teams, whereas the Kings, they were the lowest. Much like Nashville here, lowest seed you can be, and they managed to get into and win the Stanley Cup against another Cinderella team here in New Jersey. 2012 was an absolutely insane year. And the interesting part of that was it followed the 2011 year, where Boston and Vancouver, who were both relatively high seeds in their conferences, especially Vancouver being President's Trophy winners, meeting in the final wasn't a huge surprise other than to me, because I cheered for both. But that was one of those weird ones, and I'm considering doing a most entertaining Stanley Cup Finals of the decade as well. So let me know what you guys think in the comment section below, and you guys can mention Cinderella teams that didn't necessarily get to a Final Four if you want. But to me, in order to be that, quote, Cinderella team, that unlikely, potential champion, you at least need to make it to round 3. So people are saying, wait, could these guys actually win it? Round 2, you can just go, well, they got lucky, or you can say, well, that number 1 seed, they weren't any good. Vancouver in 2012 would have been that. So if LA gets knocked out in round 2, we can look at the Canucks in 2012 and say they weren't as good as they thought they were, which was a problem the Kings had in 2011, 2012. Anyways, let me know your thoughts as always in the comment section below. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. It's been a great decade, and there'll be a lot more videos about the decade and getting into like all decade teams and stuff like this. And I'm going to try to approach it, of course, from a different angle. But let me know your ideas, and I will talk to you again soon.